As we talked about last week, I thought that I would get into the book that Laura recommended. So you want to talk about race, and we'll see, how far we want to extend this conversation. It's really just an excellent text. And right now is certainly a time when we as a nation, whether it's in ourselves or in our families or in our communities or in our faith communities, we're having to talk about race because, for so long, so many of us have attempted to ignore it. So just to give you a quick idea, because I sort of pushed this out kind of late in the week, and most of you probably have not had a chance to download the book or to get it and get started on it. First of all, a little bit about the author. And she's obviously been someone whose voice is being heard and heard loudly. And as you can see there, she's been featured in New York Magazine, the Washington Post, a lot more. But I tell you, when I think about how she tells her story, that quote that I put underneath her picture on the right, that struck me very hard. I've never been able to escape the fact that I am a black woman in a white supremacist country. I was telling Laura, I think it was yesterday, that, me reading that, I mean, when I think of a white supremacist country, I think about for so much of my life, I would think of South Africa, apartheid South Africa, when language like that was used. And I always had this kind of anger and dissatisfaction about them, It never really occurred to me that that America could be viewed that way. But I was listening to NPR. I was in the car yesterday or the day before, and they had an interview with these two guys. They were both Somali-born, and they were both about to become school principals in Minnesota. And they, were interviewing them about their different experiences. One had come to the States very young, and the other one had come a little bit older. And the one who'd come when he was a little bit older mentioned the fact that, he never, race and racism was never even a thing in his mind until he came to the United States. I mean, it wasn't on the radar screen. And, I think for at least some of us, and me, I know in particular, because I grew up someplace where all there were white people, race was just wasn't a thing. I mean, it just wasn't, it wasn't a thing on my radar screen at all. It was like I lived in a country without racism because I didn't see it. But the truth is that the experience of people of color in this country is they are, like she says, presented with this inescapable fact that they live in a white supremacist culture. And that by itself was a lot for me to digest, and I'm still kind of working on it, to be honest. So as I was thinking about this, I was reminded, if you remember a couple of weeks ago when we were going through some of the Beatitudes, I mentioned in the story behind that last Beatitude, where Jesus had kind of lit into the Pharisees and the scribes who had come from Jerusalem up into the North Kingdom, up into Israel, up by the Sea of Galilee, to see him and see what his deal was, right? Well, immediately after that, basically he bugged out. He got out of town. He headed northwest up, really almost out of the country, up into Tyre, and what was really a part of ancient Syrio-Phoenicia. And so that next piece of the scripture, which is this piece right here, is what happens next, right? And this is a pretty well-known piece of scripture, but it's one that a lot of Christians have a lot of problems with, because the idea that Jesus, wasn't perfect, bugs them, all right? But I think that it's fascinating for a couple different reasons. And so it says, from there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Like I said, he was trying to get out of Dodge because he had just stepped on the toes of the Pharisees and scribes. Yet, he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. I'm going to get into this a little more deeply a little later, but one of the things that occurs to me in terms of why was this included in not just Mark but also in Matthew, and it's like, did they want to show that, hey, yeah, Jesus got it wrong too? And that's certainly, I think that's a possibility. But at the beginning of the Christian faith, it was still the Jewish faith. Jesus didn't show up and say, "Y'all going to be Christian now," right? His whole thing was, we're going to do Judaism the way it's supposed to be done, not what it's evolved into. And it's funny, 2,000 years from now, here people like me and others of us kind of on the left edge of the Jesus tent are saying, let's do Christianity the way it's supposed to be done, not the way it's evolved into. But one of the things that was important at the beginning was trying to figure out, is this only for people who are culturally Jewish, and there was even an argument, there are arguments in other places in the Bible, whether or not uncircumcised men could become Christians. So essentially what this may have been is, Jesus voicing their inner bigotry, oh, hey, you're not one of us, you're one of the dogs on the floor, but then realizing, well, you guys should have stuff too, so much as many of those people are trying to justify, do we let them in, that this is essentially, they get to see Jesus make that jump that they're being asked to make. So I think at the macro level, that's why this gets included. But if we have time, we'll take a little more at his specific reply towards the end. But I want to get into the actual book. So as she points out at the beginning of the book, we have reached a point now where even people like me that grew up in a white suburb, a white small town, we can't avoid seeing what's happening to black people. When I was a kid, we had almost no idea what was going on. There were 3 channels on television, and they basically got all their information from, AP and UPI. And if it wasn't on the 6 o'clock evening news, we didn't know what was happening. Of course, no internet. Magazines came out once a month. It was a very different world. But now, as we all know, it can be happening on the street, and people are live streaming it right then. So the widespread dissemination of video proof of brutality and injustice has really just stuck it right there in our faces, and we can't get away from it, which is, in a way, it's a good thing. And it's a horrible thing that the stuff is there. But the good thing is we can't run away from it now. We're going to have to deal with it. We have to fix it. So it's not something that we can just say, oh, I'm going to ignore that now. Now, there are a lot of people who are trying. Okay, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of people who are trying. And, for some of them, it's due to animosity. But for some of them, I think the real problem is that it's this cognitive dissonance between the world that they were told about growing up, the history books that they read, you know, the stuff that their mom told them and their preacher told them and their teachers told them and all their friends, you know, told them. So about a week ago, my brother, who is self-described as being somewhat to the right of Rush Limbaugh, calls me up and wants to fuss at a liberal. And he had his nose out of joint because they'd yanked down the statue of Columbus in Columbus, Ohio, and they're actually talking about renaming Columbus, Ohio. And, you know, I know it's not just because he's got a real thing for Christopher Columbus, but it's like, one of the first things you learned in school was that rhyme in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? That's one of those things, one of those little pieces of knowledge that as a child growing up, you know, you first get to school and you're trying to learn this stuff and feed it back to them so you get a good grade. You know, that was something you could hang your hat on. Once you learned that rhyme, you knew something, right? And now, as a grown man, to be told, no, that ain't the way that went down. For some people, that cognitive dissonance is really, and not just that, not just that, okay, hey, you know, not right, but not only was he, you know, not the discoverer of America, but he was really horrifyingly bad. He was a bad man. He did bad things, right? The sort of shame and guilt that you feel, it's tough for a lot of people to deal with. So there are a lot of people with, you know, my kind of complexion, you know, who, like this kid in this graphic image file I found, you know, are kind of getting a little red in the face because things aren't what they were told. And, you know, at one level, it kind of starts to fry the connections in your brain because things that you trusted are not trustworthy anymore. But also, it starts making you wonder how many other things that I was told are not the truth. And I thought I could trust my teachers and my mom and my dad and all these other people. And what else about my life that I thought I could count on is not the truth. So it's tough sledding for some people. So because it's tough sledding, it's going to be work, right? It's going to be work for all of us. So we really have to commit to doing this work. We can't just say, oh, well, you know, they'll fix it. They, you know, the same they that get stuff in trouble, they are the ones that are going to have to, we can't do that. We are they. We are them. We have to fix this. And in order to do that, we are going to have to take a look at some things that are going to make us a little uncomfortable or a lot uncomfortable. You know, when you look in the mirror and there's privilege staring back at you, it's kind of tough to look at. You know I am a straight, white, cisgendered guy, right? I'm like the definition of the enemy, right? I was in the military for 32 years, for crying out loud. So I know what it's like. I mean, I look at those guys that are wandering around Portland snatching people off the street. Not too long ago, I wore a uniform that looks exactly like that, except I had different patches on it. You know, actually had my name, for example. Don't get me started. Anyway, so at one point in the first chapter, the author is talking with a white friend of hers, and they're talking about how do we make things better. And his point was, well, you know what? It's really not a black-white thing. It's a rich-poor thing. And there are a lot of poor people, you know, not just black people, not just brown people, you know. Why don't we make things better for everybody, right? Let's take and make life better for all the people who are poor, and that should take care of it, right? And she asked him this question: why do you think black people are poor? Do you think it's for the same reasons that white people are? And that kind of slowed him down. And, you know, the truth is that systemically, and, you know, Laura, I know, could walk us through this really well. systemically, from the time that black people were enslaved, there have been policies and procedures put in place in this country that keep black people and black families from accumulating wealth in the same way that white people and white families have accumulated wealth over the centuries. And so the inevitable result of that is this chart that you see in front of you. And when you look at that racial wealth gap, it is, I mean, it's like if that alone doesn't tell you that we have had an issue that has stuck around a long time, it should. You know, when the average white person, according to the last census, you know, their wealth was measured at $110,729, and the average black person was $4,955. 20 to 1 is not something that you can explain away with, well, that's just the way it is. Or, you know, merit. You know, that's crazy. There's no amount of merit that merits that. The thing is that our economic system was actually founded on racism, and America would not be the country it is today without genocide and slavery. And I think we have to really own up to that. The economic system that we have still has echoes of slavery. I was really surprised. I was reading CNN this morning, and they had just a quick little blurb about, seven things you probably didn't know were connected to slavery, which included the building of both the White House and the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., New York Life, the insurance company, back in the day, under, like when it was under a different name, actually insured slaves. They insured the lives of slaves for their owners, and of course profited off of it. CSX, the nationwide freight railroad conglomerate, still owns a railroad that was built by slaves. And nobody's giving that stuff back, are they? I mean, at least they won't until we make them. But the whole idea behind racism was it was about the money, really. And this thing I really resonated with. Racism in America today, right, exists to exclude people of color from opportunity and progress, so there's more profit for others deemed superior. And when I read this, it immediately sent me back to that old quote from LBJ, which I found a meme of over here. If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. That was LBJ. He was president when I was in nursery school, kindergarten, right? Back during the Civil Rights era. And he was a guy that was actually, a little more progressive than several people that came before. But he was a plain talker. And he wasn't wrong. And it's the same fear that is driving a lot of the racial and racially divisive politics that we're seeing today. The people who look like me that don't have much are afraid they're going to lose their edge. They won't say that they're privileged because they'll swear up and down they're dirt poor and yada yada yada. But they're really afraid that those other folks, those black and brown ones, are going to pull ahead of them. And so they'll do anything they can to hang on to the privilege that they have. And it takes our humanity away. When we deem somebody else as less than, when we deem somebody else as fit to be slaughtered so that we can take over their land, or fit to be kidnapped and put in slavery so that we can get fat off of, their backs, it makes us less than human. So one of the points that she makes is that while, yes, there are some very poor people out there, and trust me, I grew up in West Virginia. I have seen it. I have seen some extremely poor people, back in the hills and hollers. It's still pretty dark and pretty gruesome in some places. But as she points out, what keeps a poor child in Appalachia poor is not what keeps a poor child in Chicago poor, even if at a distance the outcomes look the same, right? And so what keeps the able-bodied Black woman poor is not the same thing that keeps a disabled white guy poor, even if the outcome looks the same. It isn't. It may smell the same, it may feel the same at some level to some of the people, but it ain't the same. So here's the thing: when we're asking ourselves, is this something that's about race? The answer to the question, she puts it, are pretty straightforward. Number one, it is about race if a person of color says it's about race, or as the graphic there says, BIPOC, say it's about race: Black, Indigenous, people of color. That's the acronym. It is about race if it disproportionately or differently affects people of color. And number three, it is about race if it fits into a broader pattern of events that disproportionately or differently affect people of color. And boy, is there a lot of that. So, while yes, there are a lot of people who are suffering from hardships, and boy, right now, a lot of us are, right? The economy is in really bad shape. There are a lot of people who are dying, literally dying out there from this pandemic. And a lot of them are white, yes, got it. However, the hardships are hitting people of color a lot more than white people, including the ones right now, including the economic downturn that we're experiencing because of COVID-19, and including the medical statistics and the fatalities because of COVID-19. They are hitting people of color a lot harder. So here's the thing, and it's something that we have to try to get some of those white people who are having a hard time understanding that it's about race because they feel hurt, or they themselves are disadvantaged, they themselves are suffering, right? They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear that something's about race and that needs to be a fix, right? Disadvantaged white people are not erased by discussions of disadvantages facing people of color. And she says, for example, just like brain cancer is not erased by talking about breast cancer. Just because we want to find a cure for breast cancer doesn't mean we don't want to find a cure for brain cancer, right? It doesn't mean we've forgotten about that, or, people with brain cancer are just getting wheeled straight to the morgue. We just have to deal with these things differently because they're different problems. Even if they have the same result, at the end of the day, both brain cancer and breast cancer can kill you. But at the end of the day, the disadvantages some white people have and the disadvantages people of color have can sometimes have similar outcomes. Doesn't mean they're the same. So at one point in this chapter, she gets into a real personal story about an abusive boyfriend that she had and the way he treated her, and the way that he kept minimizing the things he did by pulling it down to just this one little event that happened, one little thing that he said, or one little thing that he did. And he said, how can you think that this one little thing is such a big deal? It was over and done with, and all I did was, threw away the plates because I didn't like the way you washed them. No big deal, we can get more plates. All I did was just got mad and yelled, When it wasn't the one little thing, it was all the things, you know. But because he kept pushing back on the little things, she had this to say: I could not address abuse in my relationship because I was too busy defending my right to even call it abuse. And somebody who grew up in an abusive household, that really rang with me, right? And then she makes the connection, which is so right on. She says, often being a person of color in white-dominated society is like being in an abusive relationship with the world. And I looked around for some, like, what does abusive relationship look like? And, boy, some of these things are really right on. I mean, not just for relationships, but for what she's talking about, the relationship that a person of color has with the United States of America. There's gaslighting, there's projection. It does a great job at promising a great future and then delivering a nightmare. Uses guilt, charm, hope, love, obligation, fear, or confusion to get what they want. Has a staggering lack of empathy and sincere remorse for their behavior. Yells, name calls, belittles, gives a sign. I mean, it's just such a sad but direct connection. So she says, while just about everything can be about race, almost nothing is completely about race. And it's that completely thing that some people want to try to grab and divert our attention from. I have a feeling if the prince had married any American actress who was a commoner, right, there would have been some British tabloids and probably a few members of the royal family up in arms about it, right? You kind of would expect that. But let him marry an American actress who is also a person of color, and you would think that the world was coming to an end over there in Great Britain. There were people who were just incensed, and members of the royal family that are still not over it. Not completely about race, but boy, yeah, it sure was. The thing is, as she points out, each of us sees the world through our own lens. And we can't expect that everybody else's experience is like ours, even though that's kind of the yardstick we use. Is this thing dangerous? Right? My friend James, he and Jeanette were some of our founders of MCSC, was messaging me yesterday morning, and he was saying, because he's got a motorcycle, right? And he was saying, yeah, Charles, you need to get a motorcycle and, come out riding with me. I was like, yeah. I had a motorcycle, and one day I almost got run down 3 times by motorists who were not looking for motorcycles, and I parked it in the garage, and I put a for sale sign on it, and I said, that's it, I'm done. I don't do motorcycles, right? My brother, he loves bikes. He has a couple of them. Me, from my foxhole, through my lens, oh, hell no. Like I told James, I said, if I need to get my outdoor wind in the hair motorized fix, I'll get a boat. And really the best thing to do is rent one, because a boat's just a hole in the water you pour money into. But it's all based on my experience, his experience, Russ's experience. And we all have these different experiences, and they're all valid to us because they were our experience, right? But we compute things, and this goes clear back to, is it dangerous, right? That out there on the tundra, something's different, the reticular activating system, something's different. Is it going to eat me? Can I eat it, right? So we use our own yardstick. And because of some things that were said about me at my last church, this particular Dilbert jumped off the page at me. So Dilbert goes to a meeting, and his coworker says, let's begin the meeting, but be aware that I'm documenting all of your bullying behavior. And Dilbert says, I'm not even close to being a bully, but now your confirmation bias will make everything I say sound like bullying to you. And she's like, click, 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 click. Can you repeat the part after you implied that I'm a delusional witch? And so, confirmation bias, our bias based on our own experience, it's difficult to get away from. And one of those places where self-awareness is a really excellent tool to have in our toolkit, and make sure that it's got a lot of fingerprints on it and it's really worn around the edges from us using it a lot. Okay. At the end of the day, if you think it's about race, you're right. If it feels like it's about race, you think it's about race, yeah, it's probably about race. And it more than likely is going to stay about race until we fix it being about race. So now I want to kind of get back to the end of the story. So back there where Jesus, right? Remember, she says, hey, even the dogs get the crumbs that the kids drop on the floor. And Jesus says, for saying that, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. So if we tear that apart, and of course, we're reading into it with our lens today, but there's quite a lot there, right? So for saying that, right, we can see that he's amplifying her voice. He's saying, yeah, you called it, you got it. So that he's saying, yes, this woman's critique was valid, and really in the ancient world, what he's saying is, yeah, even what these Gentiles are saying, they want to be part of this. That's valid, right? So that the heal, and this is important, the healing he performs is not a matter of mercy, but one of justice, right? She deserved that. It wasn't just his largesse, right? She deserved it. And by contrast, white fragility moves to recenter the white voice, right? And if we do happen to engage in any kind of anti-racist thing, we frame it as a kind of largesse, rather than simply giving people, what they're owed. Saying, yeah, that was the right thing. You may go. He's not asking for anything else from her. He's not asking for acknowledgement. He's not asking for a thank you. He's not asking for anything else. He's not even asking for her to make up to him and say, oh, okay, that's okay that you called me a dog, He just says, you're good, right? White fragility demands that should we do right, we have to be thanked, right? And acknowledged and forgiven and told we're all good, it's all good. Really doing right just says, hey, we're good. Here, I fixed you. That's all. That's all. Right? We're done. The demon has left your daughter. He makes amends. He amends his behavior, delivers her justice. And then Mark, this is actually told in a couple of the Gospels, but Mark actually confirms that the girl was made whole, that she was healed. White fragility, by contrast, will focus on sentiment and statement rather than change, action, and restitution. And those are things that, going forward, that I think that we have to advocate for: change, action, and restitution.